Ferrari may have led both practice sessions in Monaco, but the timing sheets do not tell the full story, especially when it comes to how much closer Max Verstappen looks than many expected heading into the weekend. Just a few days ago, Verstappen was not sounding especially confident about Monaco at all. He kept pointing to the RB22's weaknesses over curbs, bumps, and the kind of low-speed corners that have raised questions about Red Bull's limitations across the 2026 season. Even after finishing on the podium in Canada, he still felt the team did not quite have the package needed to seriously pressure Ferrari around Formula One's most technical street circuit. But after only 2 practice sessions, that outlook has already started to shift. In FP1, Verstappen was still more than half a second off Charles Leclerc's pace. By the end of FP2, though, that gap had come down to just 168 seconds from the quickest time, and that is a major change in a very short span of time. Even more telling, Verstappen and Red Bull both left Friday sounding noticeably more encouraged by the steps they made as the day went on. Meanwhile, on the other side of the garage, Charles Leclerc admitted he is still working through brake-related issues that have reportedly been troubling him over the last 2 race weekends. That really changes the picture heading into qualifying. Ferrari may still be the favorite on paper, but when Leclerc himself says Verstappen is extremely close, and Red Bull seems to have found a more effective setup direction after the lessons from Canada, the whole situation becomes a lot more complicated than the practice times suggest. So the big question is simple but hugely important. Does Ferrari still have full control of the fight for pole position in Monaco? Or is Verstappen quietly setting up the kind of surprise that could flip this weekend on its head? If you enjoy Formula One analysis that focuses on the facts, the technical details, and the bigger story behind the headlines, stay tuned, because now we are breaking down why Verstappen's chances may be much stronger than they first appeared. At first glance, Friday seemed to back up what many people expected before a single wheel even turned. Ferrari arrived in Monaco with a reputation as the standard in slow-speed corners, and the opening day seemed to reinforce that idea. Charles Leclerc led FP1, Lewis Hamilton finished right behind him, and the same pattern repeated itself in FP2. Around a circuit where confidence, traction, and precision matter far more than raw power, Ferrari looked strong from the start. But the deeper you look at the day, the harder it gets to call Ferrari's edge comfortable. The first clue came from Leclerc himself. Instead of presenting Ferrari as clearly ahead, he made a point of stressing the challenge from Red Bull. Red Bull and Max especially were very close to us in FP2, so I expect them to be very strong, he said afterwards. That does not sound like a driver who thinks pole position is already locked up. It sounds more like someone who sees a rival building real momentum. Leclerc's warning carries even more weight when you put it next to his own comments about the car. He said he has been dealing with brake-related issues for 2 straight race weekends, and that Monaco has only made the situation feel more difficult. Unfortunately, it's been 2 weekends since I'm facing some issues with the brakes, he explained. I just lost a little bit of confidence. In Monaco, confidence under braking is not a small detail, it is a major part of everything. That is exactly why so many viewers are taking Leclerc's comments seriously. When a driver openly admits he is still trying to sort out braking confidence, people immediately start wondering whether that small issue could matter a lot more in Monaco than it would somewhere else. On a track this tight, even a slight hesitation can change the whole picture. And that is why the discussion around Ferrari has become more complicated than a simple practice headline. At the same time, Red Bull's progress cannot be brushed aside. The fact that Verstappen looked much closer by the end of Friday has already shifted the online conversation because it suggests the team may have found something useful as the session went on. Of course, practice is still practice, and the real pressure will come when everything is on the line. But the reaction from both garages makes one thing clear: this is no longer being treated like a one-sided Ferrari advantage. It is one of the biggest foundations of performance in Monaco. Drivers are repeatedly sending cars into corners boxed in by barriers, with almost no room for error. Every braking zone demands full commitment, and every lockup can carry serious consequences. So when Leclerc talks about reduced confidence and small mistakes under braking, it quickly becomes a detail worth watching closely heading into qualifying. What makes this so interesting is that none of those concerns stopped Ferrari from setting the pace. Even with Leclerc's worries, Ferrari still held the top two positions, which suggests the car's underlying speed is still very strong. But Monaco qualifying is usually decided by tiny gaps, and sometimes a tenth of a second is enough to separate pole position from the second row. In that kind of environment, even a slight dip in driver confidence can suddenly matter a lot. Verstappen's Friday, meanwhile, followed almost the opposite path. Before the weekend, his comments sounded fairly cautious. He spoke openly about Red Bull's weakness over bumps and curbs, and Monaco is exactly the kind of circuit that tends to expose those areas. He also acknowledged Ferrari's recent pace in slow corners, saying they looked like the likely favorites coming into the weekend. Then practice began, and the tone started to shift. By the end of FP1, Verstappen was third, a little more than half a second behind Leclerc. Respectable, but not especially threatening at that stage. By the end of FP2, though, the picture had changed in a major way. That is why the conversation around Saturday has taken on a different tone. What started as a simple Ferrari versus Red Bull comparison is now being treated more like a narrow, high-stakes battle where a small setup gain or a tiny loss of confidence could swing the whole order. In Monaco, that kind of margin matters even more, because the track gives drivers very little room to recover if something feels off. For Ferrari, the encouraging part is obvious. The car still appears to have the speed to stay at the sharp end, but the concern comes from how quickly things can change once the pressure rises and the laps start getting cleaner. A driver can feel comfortable in practice and still run into trouble when qualifying forces everything to be perfect on the first try. That is also why Verstappen's improved showing is getting so much attention online. People are not saying the weekend is decided, but they are clearly noting that the gap looked far more manageable than many expected at the start. And in a place like Monaco, where confidence and precision often matter as much as outright pace, even a small shift in the balance can make the whole fight feel a lot less predictable. The gap had dropped to 168 seconds, and suddenly Ferrari's early control looked a lot less certain. Just as important, Verstappen's tone had clearly shifted. "It was a pretty positive day, to be honest," he said. "I felt very good in the car, especially during the second practice. We made good progress." That stands out because Verstappen is usually not one to hand out praise lightly when it comes to his machinery. Across his career, he has developed a reputation for being brutally honest about what a car can and cannot do. So when he says he feels good behind the wheel, it usually reads as real confidence rather than polished public messaging. That same feeling seemed to be shared inside Red Bull, where Chief Engineer Paul Monahan also sounded encouraged by what the team found over the course of Friday. He stopped short of talking about pole position, but his remarks made it clear this is a group that believes it has something to work with. "We felt pretty encouraged by our performance today," Monahan explained. "We will need to work hard tonight, and the drivers will, of course, need to perform at their best tomorrow." That last part matters even more in Monaco, because gains here are rarely the result of some huge overnight upgrade. More often, they come from squeezing out more confidence, balance, and precision from a car that is already close to the limit. Monahan's comments also showed just how tight the fight appears to be. That is what makes the online reaction feel so intense right now. People are not just comparing lap times, they are looking at the way both camps are talking, and that often says as much as the stopwatch itself. For viewers, the key issue is how quickly a small concern can grow inside a place like Monaco. There's almost no margin to recover if the car is not exactly right, and that is why every bit of uncertainty gets picked apart so closely. At the same time, Red Bull's improved tone has given supporters plenty to point to, especially after Verstappen sounded far more comfortable than he did before the weekend began. So even without a final answer yet, the discussion has already moved beyond simple practice headlines. What looked like Ferrari control at the start of Friday is now being treated more like a very narrow fight, with confidence, setup, and clean execution all carrying real weight going into Saturday. If Ferrari is a bit quicker than us, we've got to do a little bit better job tonight. We'll be faster than them tomorrow. It is hard to picture that kind of line coming out if Red Bull truly thought the gap was half a second. The wording sounds more like a team that believes there is a real path to putting Ferrari under pressure. Another telling detail came from George Russell. Mercedes had come into Monaco expecting Red Bull to struggle, since that track looked like it might expose the RB22's weaker areas. But after Friday, Russell admitted the pace had been a bit of a surprise. "I think the direction in Montreal wasn't progress at all, but it was analyzed properly, and I think it became quite clear." Those comments make it seem as if Monaco may be benefiting from a reset in approach. Instead of sticking with a setup idea that Verstappen had suggested was holding the car back, Red Bull appears to have moved back toward a direction that better matched the driver's feedback. That does not suddenly make the RB22 the benchmark car, but it does help explain why Verstappen sounded much more comfortable by the end of Friday than he did before the weekend even started. There is also another point that should not be ignored. Monaco qualifying is rarely decided by raw pace alone. Traffic management, tire preparation, and the way the track keeps improving often matter just as much, and sometimes even more. That is why Saturday now feels bigger than just another qualifying day. In Monaco, once the lap starts, there is almost no room to hide a weakness and no easy way to recover if a driver gets caught out by traffic, tire prep, or a car that is not quite in the right window. So even the smallest adjustment can completely change how the weekend is viewed. For Ferrari, that means the pressure is not only about having pace, it is about proving the car can stay sharp when it really counts. For Red Bull, the story is different, because the growing confidence around Verstappen has turned what looked like a difficult weekend into something much more open-ended. The online reaction reflects that shift too, with viewers now treating this less like a predictable Ferrari advantage and more like a battle that could tighten fast once the lap times start mattering for real. And that is where the tension really sits. Practice can give a clue, but Monaco often raised questions about anything that was only barely working in the background. If Ferrari's brake concerns continue to linger, or if Red Bull's progress holds up under qualifying pressure, the entire order could look very different by the end of the day. That uncertainty is exactly why so many people are watching this one closely. Managhan pointed directly to that problem when he broke down the challenges Red Bull is facing. "In Q1, you need space and not get held up," he said. It sounds simple enough, but Monaco often turns qualifying into a tactical maze, where one compromised lap can wreck an entire session. If a car appears in the wrong place at the wrong time, it can cost several tenths in an instant. And if a run gets mistimed, a driver can end up stuck in traffic with no real chance to recover. That is why Leclerc's warning has drawn so much attention. He did not just suggest Verstappen was close, he also implied the field could tighten up sharply once qualifying begins. Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari all seem capable of operating inside a very narrow performance window, at least based on Friday's discussions. In that kind of setup, execution matters just as much as raw speed, maybe even more. The broader picture backs that up too. Hamilton led FP2 by only 111 seconds from Leclerc. Verstappen was just 168 seconds back, while Russell was less than 4/10 off the fastest Ferrari. The margins between the front-runners are incredibly tight. That kind of spread creates an atmosphere where confidence, preparation, and driver commitment could decide the result more than the cars themselves. And very few drivers in Formula One history have built a reputation for squeezing the maximum out of qualifying like Verstappen. That is exactly why the mood around this session feels so charged. When the margins are this tiny, every comment from the drivers starts to matter almost as much as the lap times themselves. One small shift in setup, one cleaner run, or one mistake in traffic can completely change how the whole weekend is being interpreted. Monaco has a way of turning simple practice numbers into something much bigger, because the track leaves nowhere to hide. If the car is not in the right window, the weakness shows up fast, and if it is, people start talking about momentum, confidence, and whether a team has found the right answer at the right time. That is why the online discussion has moved so quickly from raw pace to who sounds more settled heading into qualifying. For Ferrari, the pressure now is less about being quickest in a single session and more about proving the car can hold up when the intensity rises. For Verstappen, the conversation is completely different, because the growing sense that Red Bull has found a better direction has made this feel a lot less one-sided than it first appeared. And that is where the suspense really lives. A session like this can look straightforward on paper, but in Monaco, the smallest uncertainty can ripple through the entire field once everyone is fighting for position. That is why viewers are paying such close attention to every update, every quote, and every hint of confidence or concern coming out of the paddock. That does not mean Ferrari should suddenly be treated like outsiders. Not at all. Their showing across both sessions was strong, and the pace looked real rather than artificial. Leclerc is still one of the best Monaco specialists on the grid, and Hamilton's speed was encouraging too. But Friday was never really a story about Ferrari running away with it. The bigger point was the gap between what people expected and what actually happened. The expectation was that Monaco would expose Red Bull's weaker areas. Instead, Verstappen ended the day less than 0.2 off the quickest time and sounding more confident as the session went on. The expectation was that Ferrari would build a comfortable cushion. Instead, their edge now looks much less secure. The expectation was that Verstappen would just try to minimize the damage. Instead, he heads into qualifying with a realistic incident at pole, at least based on Friday's pace. That is why Saturday suddenly feels a lot more important than many first thought. Ferrari still hold the advantage. That is what makes this whole situation so hard to read. On one hand, Ferrari still looks strong enough to command respect, and nobody is pretending their Friday pace was empty hype. On the other hand, the tone around the paddock has clearly shifted, because Verstappen no longer sounds like a driver simply hoping to survive Monaco without losing too much ground. That change matters, since Monaco has a strange way of amplifying every small swing in confidence. A team can look comfortable in practice, then suddenly find itself under pressure the moment qualifying starts and everyone pushes harder. Once that happens, the conversation stops being about who looked best on Friday and starts becoming about who can actually deliver when the track gets crowded and the stakes rise. That is also why the online chatter has become so intense. People are not just reacting to lap times, they are reacting to the mood, the body language, and the way both camps are framing their chances. Ferrari may still have the edge in the overall conversation, but the idea that the weekend was already leaning one way has clearly started to fade. So heading into qualifying, the sense of certainty is gone. What is left is a much sharper contest, with one side trying to protect its advantage, and the other looking increasingly capable of making this a real fight. In a place like Monaco, that kind of shift can happen very fast, and once it does, the whole picture changes. The timing screens back that up, but Formula One has never been only about the quickest practice lap. It is also about reading the direction of the weekend, and right now that direction seems to be leaning toward Max Verstappen. So as qualifying gets closer, one question still hangs over everything. Has Ferrari really done enough to keep Verstappen behind when it matters? Or are we about to see Red Bull and Verstappen turn a weekend that looked difficult into a genuine pole position fight? If this Monaco battle has you rethinking the pecking order, like, subscribe, share, and comment your take, and see you on the next one.